All the little buttons, getting everything in the right spot. Okay. Looks like things are in the right place. How's everyone doing today?
Pretty good, thank you.
Glad to hear it. All right, so it is 6:02. I think that's about right to go ahead and begin. So, well, when I say begin, I mean continue. We couldn't quite finish the discussion of the Seder and the Haggadah last week, which is not surprising because it definitely takes longer in real time when you're doing it on Passover night. But I wanted to finish that up before we dive into the details of Chametz, the leavening that we are avoiding during Pesach, as well as how we clean to make sure that we have gotten rid of it. So let's go ahead then and dive back in, pick up where we left off. You may remember we left off with dinner, which was a nice place to pause. And indeed, many people, I regret to say, will often get to the dinner portion of the Seder, have their dinner, loosen their belt, and call it a night. But the Seder does not finish with dinner. The dinner is a huge and important part of the Passover celebration, but it's not the end of the celebration. There are a number of portions that we need to take care of on the back end of the Seder. So let's go in order. So first of all, we have to have the end of our dinner. And the end of the dinner is called the tzafun. Now, the tzafun is when we eat the afikomen. Remember, way back at the beginning, we talked about breaking the middle matzah and setting aside one part of the matzah, the larger portion, as the afikomen. Well, the afikomen is saved until this moment, and we eat it as our final food. So everything else that you're having for dinner that night, any desserts that you're having for dinner that night, all of that is done, and then we eat the afikomen. It should be the last taste in our mouth until the next day. So the afikomen has a very important status. This was one of the differentiators between us and many of the other people of the ancient world who also had symposia, these very elaborate meals. We finished with this lechem oni, this bread of affliction. We finished with this simple food. They finished and went on to the next meal or went to the next house, the modern version or the ancient version of a pub crawl. We wanted to say that although our meal should be wonderful and we should enjoy it as free people, still we have to remember the taste of Egypt, and that taste is embodied in the matzah. So the afikomen is eaten as our final thing, and in fact, without the afikomen, we can't finish the meal, and that means we can't finish the Seder. This has led to customs in different Jewish communities where the children will play an important role. Now, many of the different changes that we've talked about from our meal style that go all the way back that we enumerated in the 4 questions and many other things beside, many of them are designed to keep the children interested. But how do you keep them interested even after dinner? Well, you make sure that they keep their eyes on the afikomen. So there are customs in some households for the family to hide the afikomen, and then the children have to find it. And then there are others where the children will try to kidnap it, and then they will ransom it back. But in any way that you do it, the Afikomen is often a fun time for the children. It has kept them alert and awake till this point, and usually there is some kind of small prize or gift that you give to them for the finding of the Afikomen, for allowing our meal to continue. So this is a lovely custom and one that I highly approve of, and you can find a way to make it work for your family. Even if you don't have children, and even if you don't have somebody hiding or finding the Afikomen, do still remember to eat the Afikomen. Don't let it be forgotten about. It should still be your final food for the mealtime. And by food, I mean solid food, because we still have 2 more cups of wine to go. And in fact, the next cup of wine is Barech, is the wine that goes along with Birkat Hamazon, the blessing after our meal. And this time we sing that blessing, which we do anytime we eat a significant meal, a meal that is established by bread, in this case matzah. There are special paragraphs and phrases that are added in honor of Pesach, in honor of Passover. And we also finish it with a cup of wine. Now, that is a custom in many communities to do anytime we do a special Birkat Hamazon, but on Passover, it is a very official custom that is kept by everyone, even those who wouldn't normally have an additional cup of wine for their routine Birkat Hamazon. But for Pesach, everyone does, and that is our 3rd cup of wine. Everyone with me so far? Great. Then we have Hallel. Now, you may remember that before the meal, when we had finished the retelling of the story of our enslavement in Egypt and the Exodus, that we had begun with the first 2 Psalms of Hallel, Psalm 113, Psalm 114, and then we interrupted that for the focus on the mitzvot of eating, the matzah, the maror, and then, of course, the meal itself. Well, now we resume Hallel. And indeed, there are additional songs that have been written that go beyond the book of Psalms. And those songs are sung with great enthusiasm and love and dedication. But just understand that by putting the bookends of the beginning of Hallel and the end of Hallel around the meal, we are proclaiming that the meal is not just about your stomach. The meal is not just about the taste buds. The meal is about a celebration of a gift of freedom, a gift of God's revelation that freedom and justice are what the world should have. And that is a gift that our dinner is dedicated to. So when we're eating, we are not turning away from that idea. We are celebrating it because eating as we do in the modern world is something that is only possible thanks to what God did for us in Egypt, and more importantly, what God did to reveal to the world that justice and freedom were the natural state for human beings and one that we should aspire to. And thankfully, in this day and age, we are getting closer and closer. It's not perfect, unfortunately. Slavery and exploitation continue, but we are getting closer and closer to the point where we at least all agree, and agreement, of course, should lead to action. Then we reach the next section of the Seder called, oh, I'm sorry, was there a question or comment? I heard somebody unmute. Or maybe that was just a mistaken button. That's okay. So now we reach the section of the Seder called Nirtzah, and this is the official conclusion. And this is where we drink our 4th cup of wine as separate and distinct from all of the others. And we also pour a 5th cup of wine. Now, that 5th cup of wine represents a 5th promise. The continuation from Exodus chapter 6 that goes on from the promises we saw in the beginning of our discussion last week says, I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. So the idea here is this promise of giving us the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob a promise that we celebrate during Pesach, during the celebration of the Exodus from Egypt? Or is this promise something that we certainly appreciate, but does not belong with the Exodus, but would belong for other times of celebration? So there is what we call safek, there is doubt. We're not sure whether this last promise, this 5th promise, is part of the holiday or not. And so we leave the cup poured, but we don't drink from it. It is a compromised position, if you will. We are acknowledging that promise. We are acknowledging the gift that God gave us by leading us to the land of Israel, but we are not saying that the celebration of the Exodus is based only on leading us to the land of Israel. And that's a very important distinction. Judaism wants to celebrate the right theme in the right time. And certainly we celebrate coming to Israel, but as we saw when we discussed the verses of Dayenu, celebrating what God gave us is indeed sufficient. And since Pesach is a celebration of the Exodus from Egypt, we focus on that. And so we refrain from drinking that fifth cup. And in fact, it is often called the cup of Elijah. Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi, is considered in rabbinic teachings to be the person who will come before Mashiach, before the Messiah. And he will come in a way that will not only tell us that the Messiah is coming, but will also clarify many of the questions that we have about Jewish law and practice. One of the ones we're going to ask him when he shows up is cup number 5. Do we include it on Passover or not? So by having that cup poured and ready to go, we are saying not only that we are prepared for the Mashiach to come, but that we are ready to show that we are waiting for it to happen at any time. And so if Elijah shows up, we can say not only what should we do with this fifth cup, but we can say we knew you would come. We had faith. Just as God redeemed us in the land of Egypt, we knew that God would send a Mashiach, would send the Messiah to bring redemption for us and the world in this day as well. So that fifth cup is a cup of promise. It is a cup of potential. It is a cup of hope. And we don't drink from it, but we look at it expectantly as a sign of preparation for what will come soon, we hope. Any questions on that point?
Rabbi?
Yes.
What about the newer tradition of Miriam's Cup?
Okay. So what about the tradition of Miriam's Cup? Is a great question. So in the modern world, there have become a number of new traditions, and I'll talk not only about Miriam's Cup, but some of the other ones as well. And the idea is that the Seder was originally, as we saw in last week's discussion, more of a skeleton of how we should guide our study and thinking during that service. However, over time, that skeleton began to be filled in, and the parts that were filled in, the various texts and phrases and songs, became more established. And certainly with the rise of the printing press, it became almost crystallized, and changes became much less frequent. In the modern world, beginning in the middle of the 20th century and continuing into the 21st, people have re-engaged their creativity and re-engaged their desire to continue to add things to the Seder that will provoke conversation, that will provoke thought, and above all, provoke celebration of what God has done for us and where we are today. One very famous example of that is to have an additional cup that is poured in honor of Miriam. Now, since it is not what you would call a mitzvah cup, there doesn't need to be a special blessing for it beyond just Berei Pri Hagafen. It doesn't have to fit in any particular part of the service, but instead, it is a nice tradition that is perfectly allowed for those that would like to ensure that we don't forget some of the additional people who participated in the Exodus. Now, that being said, it is important to recognize that even as we celebrate Miriam, we should note that Moses himself is not celebrated very much during the Passover retelling. Of course, we all know that Moses was the main person who led us out of Egypt, but there's a little bit of an issue of whether or not we are going to overshadow God by focusing on the human that was the instrument of God's miracles. And so Moses is very much a second stringer in the story of the Exodus when told during Pesach. That is one reason why the text that forms the heart of the Magid, the text of the first fruits offerings of my father was a wandering Aramean, doesn't mention Moses at all, so that our focus should be 100% on God, even while remembering our ancestors of flesh and blood. So adding something that gives us a connection to Miriam is perfectly fine, but we need to make sure that that connection still has a very godly focus on it, so that it is not just that Miriam in and of herself was great. She was, but on Passover, we're celebrating her role in helping to lead us and lead especially the women towards that celebration of redemption, and her role in having the foresight to save her brother and make sure that he could be raised properly. And those are all considered to be more miraculous and divine elements. So absolutely perfectly fine, but we need to make sure we keep it in the proper context. The other very common topic or addition to the Seder plate comes from my understanding, Shoshana Heschel, the daughter of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Zichrono Livracha, who, in response to a conversation where somebody rejoined that women had as much business doing this as an orange has on a Seder plate, she began the custom of putting an orange on the Seder plate. Now, again, nothing wrong with that. And as a symbol to pique interest and to remind people of the centrality of women within Jewish life and within Jewish ritual, I think it has been a great symbol. But like all the other symbols of the Seder, we need to make sure that when we put it out and when we have it there in front of us, that we actually think about what it represents and what it represents in context for us religiously and spiritually. So by putting it orange and saying this represents the amazing vitality of the women of Israel during their time of Egypt, for after all, it was the women of Israel that made sure that our children were still able to be raised and live, and that this represents the vitality of Jewish women throughout the Exodus and throughout our ages. And in many cases, their stories have not been preserved as much as we would have liked. That is great. But if you put an orange out there, make sure you talk about it. And that goes the same for any other additions that people have invented over the last 50 years or so, that if you put it out, it's fine to talk about it, but don't talk about it in some detached form. Don't say, I'm putting this out in celebration of this issue, this cause, or this function. Make sure that you are tying it back in to the story of the Exodus so that we can understand the Exodus truly is the template for redemption, for the freedom of people, the liberation from bondage and slavery, and the turning to God in order to recognize what is just, what is right, and what is fair in the world. And any additional symbols you would like to use to celebrate those ideas are perfectly fine. Again, as long as they are Passover appropriate. So don't put a donut on the Seder plate because that's not kosher for Passover. With that in mind, we're going to use that as my segue towards part 2. And just give me a moment while I play with my screens and begin to get things ready on the other side. Just a second. Sorry, just having a little bit of complication with one of the other aspects, but hopefully that's fine. Oh, and that wasn't on the front page. There we go. And where's the button? There's the button. All right, Pesach part 2. Toiling, the work. It's not so bad, or at least it doesn't need to be bad. I gave a presentation on Monday talking about some of the Q&As. But this is more of the general explanation of why we do Pesach as we do, why we celebrate it, in particular with the issue of our leavening. So, back to the book of Exodus, chapter 13. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, what we call Matzah, and on the 7th day there shall be a festival of the Lord. A reminder that, that the end of Passover is also a holiday, not only the first day. Throughout the 7 days, unleavened bread shall be eaten. No leavened bread shall be found with you, and no leaven shall be found in all your territory. As we talked about before, this is what God told us to do. So the removal and the non-eating of leavened bread is an essential element of this week-long celebration of Passover. I want to clarify one thing very quickly. When it says that you will eat unleavened bread for 7 days, that does not mean that you are obligated to go out and willingly eat more matzah than you actually want. What it means is you are not allowed to eat any other kind of bread. For most of our history, bread was what made civilization. And so whether it was leavened or unleavened, you were eating bread most days. And if you weren't eating bread, usually that meant you were starving to death. So when the Torah tells us that we will eat only unleavened bread, it is simply saying don't eat leavened bread. But if matzah is not healthy for you, if matzah is not your favorite food, you are only obligated by the commandment to eat a little matzah at the actual Seder. On the other days of Passover, you can avoid matzah and you can just eat fruit and veg and meat and whatever else that is kosher for Passover. And that's something we're going to cover in a lot more detail in just a second. So don't misunderstand. You're not forced to eat matzah every single meal of Passover, only for the Seder. And then, of course, when Shabbat rolls around, you need to have something for the motzi, and that's going to be matzah as well. All right, so let's dive into this whole question. Where'd my mouse go? We talked about the different mitzvot last week. We explained that the Passover sacrifice for Korban Pesach is no longer possible. We can't use a lamb. We also talked about the Passover ritual meal, known as the Seder, and we talked about eating matzah and maror. We did a little bit about maror last time. We're going to do a lot more about matzah, and we're going to do a lot more about removing chametz. Chametz being the Hebrew word for leavening, and personally, I think the easier word, because who uses the term leavening in casual conversation? So let's get down to detail. So to understand chametz and matzah, we have to recognize they are both bread. They are both what Hebrew calls lechem. That's very, very important because we are always allowed to eat lechem. We're always allowed to eat bread. The question is only which variety of bread can we eat? And during Passover, we have to get rid of chametz, the leavened type of bread. And we're going to get very technical in just a second on that. And for the mitzvah of the Seder, we are commanded to eat matzah, which is the not leavened bread. Matzah, therefore, because these are the same types of things, has to be made with ingredients that could potentially become chametz. Specifically, as the Mishnah tells us, these are the things with which one fulfills the obligation on Pesach: wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. Now, most of you probably eat wheat out of all of these as your normal form of bread. Some of you might eat barley bread occasionally. Most people don't because, quite frankly, it's not as good as wheat, at least not tasting. Most people might eat rye if they're having a particular type of belly sandwich. Some people will eat oat as oatmeal or other types of baked goods, but few people eat oat as bread. So in the modern world, wheat is the sort of the king. But if you want to make matzah, it has to be made with one of these 5 types. And if you are worried about chametz, you only need to be worried if it was made with one of these 5 types of grain. Meaning anything else that is dirty in your house, that is not made out of wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats, is not chametz, and thus you do not need to focus on it during the Passover preparation. So if there is grease, from the car, if there is oil from your car, if there is mud on your back on the floor, if there are things that your pets have left as little gifts, by all means, clean them up, keep your house tidy and nice, but that's not Passover cleaning. Passover cleaning is laser focused only on the issue of chametz and only on the issue there of wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. Everyone got that basic principle? So that's good, right? Dirt is not chametz. Schmutz, the great Yiddish word, is not chametz. only something made with one of these 5 ingredients is chametz. This also means, by the way, that for people that have a gluten sensitivity or who are affected by celiacs, that there are problems for doing the mitzvah of matzah. And you should consult with your doctor and your rabbi to see exactly what your particulars are. But certainly if a grain is unhealthy for you, according to your medical opinion, then you are exempt from eating the matzah. If a small amount is acceptable according to the medical opinion and your particular case, then by all means eat matzah. But eating a matzah that was made without barley spelt, wheat, barley spelt, rye, or oats, if it doesn't include at least one of those, you're not actually doing the mitzvah. And that's okay. You can eat it just for the flavor and the experience. And the gluten-free matzahs, for example, are something that you can get now. But technically, you're not fulfilling the commandment. And that's okay if there is a dire health reason to avoid it. And like I said, you can talk to your doctor and consult with your rabbi about your specific case. But we're going to move on for the general view. All right. So how does this actually come based off their understanding of the Torah? So in Exodus 12:19, we see that for 7 days, seor, which is the technical word for leavening, think of it like a sourdough ball that would have been used in the ancient world before they had modern forms of yeast addition, that will not be found in your homes. Now, says the Midrash, this tells me only that transgression against finding it. How do I know? How do I derive that I shouldn't even be able to see it? Well, from Exodus 13:7, and seor shall not be seen to you in all of your boundaries. This tells me only that seor is subject to the injunctions against being seen and found. All right. How do I know? The same is for chametz, meaning something that was made with the leavening that has now been transformed. It is written also in 13, chametz shall not be seen to you, and seor shall not be seen to you. We get both. Seor is likened to chametz, and chametz to seor. They seem to be being treated as the same type of category. Just as the first seor is subject to both, so the second. Just as the second is of the 5 species, so the first. Right? So the 5 species, wheat, barley, rye, spelt, and oats, those are the only 5 that matter, because that is the equivalency that the rabbis are seeing in these verses. Just wanted to share that as a little bit of how these ideas and rules are found in the Torah. If you don't quite follow, that's okay. Now, once you've got your proper ingredient, one of the 5 species, then you also need the second ingredient, time. Leavening happens when water and flour are mixed and left for a time. Period. That's it. There is no special ingredient that is needed other than flour and water and time. Now, originally, leavening was something that people could tell just by looking at the dough. However, sometimes the dough doesn't give any signs. Anybody here who's ever baked bread or done other types of baking where they have to wait for something to rise, sometimes you can tell how much it's risen. Sometimes it doesn't give off a lot of signs of how much rising it's doing. In particular, when you're talking about dough that has been made without adding additional yeast to it. So the sages gave us a rule of thumb to help us avoid using dough that has leavened. Now, this is important to understand. In the ancient world, really until almost the modern world, people had to make bread for themselves every day. They didn't have pre-made matzah just sitting in a box on the shelf. If you wanted something to eat, you were baking it that day. You take the flour, you take the water, you'd mix it, you make it. So that meant that the average person, up until the modern time, had to know how to make their own matzah. Nowadays, we don't. Nowadays, we have great machines that do it for us, and it's a great time saver, and it removes a lot of doubt and stress. But I still want you to understand the basic principle, that the rule of thumb is, that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, that the time in which it is left together, that it takes a person to walk from Migdal Nunaya to Tiberia, which is a meal, which is 2,000 cubits. Now, in case you don't know how long it takes to walk 2,000 cubits, which is about 3,000 feet, over rough terrain, not necessarily on a road, well, that is generally estimated to be about 18 minutes. And so the time from the moment the water and the flour hit each other, you have 18 minutes to finish getting the dough ready and in the oven. Like I said, in the modern world, I'm sure that all of us are going to eat machine matzah. It's just easier, and from the matzah that I've tried to make myself, it's also tastier to eat the machine matzah. But if you wanted to know the details of it, 18 minutes is your window of opportunity. Now, as long as we're talking about flour, and in particular talking about the flour being made with, one more time, wheat, barley, rye, spelt, and oats, how do you end up with this issue around what's called kitniot? Kitniot, or in English often called legumes, are beans and other bean-like substances or other grain-like items, meaning things like corn or rice. And there's a question of, in the Ashkenazic world, that is to say, people from Eastern and Central Europe don't eat those products during Passover. Why not? Well, a little bit of history. In Europe, many people used bean flour in addition to grain flour. So they would make things out of wheat, but they would also make things out of beans. Remember, they had to supplement their diet with as many different things that they could grow as possible. And until the modern world, most people were worried about not having enough calories rather than worrying about too many. So bean flour was an important addition that would be kept in most houses as an additional source of flour, just in case you didn't have enough grain flour. Now, before modern bleaching of flour, that's why most flour now is very, very white, grain flour used to be a lot darker, similar to bean flour, in fact, in color and, in fact, in texture. So that made mistakes very easy. As I mentioned, people were making their own matzah throughout the holiday. So if they took grain flour, thinking it was bean flour, they would not bake it as quickly. They didn't have to rush. They didn't have the 18-minute time limit. And so they would have accidentally created chametz, which could mess up the food that they're serving it with. It could mess up the surfaces on which it was prepared. It could mess up the oven. It could mess up their baking devices. It was a big problem, not to say, the breaking of the commandment. So the Ashkenazic authorities, the European authorities said, don't use beans or similar type foods throughout the holiday to avoid the mistakes. Now, Sephardic Jews didn't have this concern, and so they didn't follow this practice. Now, in the modern world, even if you were raised with the restriction on kitniot, most modern authorities allow you to eat beans in their natural state. After all, if I am eating a long runner bean, I'm not going to accidentally mistake that for a pile of flour. It's pretty easy to tell them apart. However, many people still will continue to avoid beans and anything that falls under kitniot completely during Passover as a way of respecting the traditions of their ancestors. Personally, since I was not raised with that restriction, I have no problem with kitniot, no problem with using beans and other type products, as long as I know they are kosher for Passover by all other measures and standards. Modern manufactured foods can often have additional ingredients added that you wouldn't think are there without careful investigation, which is why you still want to look for a kosher for Passover stamp if you are buying any manufactured food. But if you're buying fresh vegetables, like beans, then you are fine as long as you give them a wash, you know you're good, and you can eat them as well. Any questions on kitniot? Okay, then we can get to everybody's favorite topic, cleaning up. So first, let's talk a little bit about what the Mishnah itself says, and then we'll go into the practical application of that. So the Mishnah gives a very simple description. On the evening of the 14th, that's the day before Passover would begin, they search the house for chametz by the light of a lamp. Every place into which chametz is not brought does not require searching. Very, very simple. you've got one evening's worth of cleaning up. Now, if you lived in a house that had one room, like most people did, and you generally cooked outside and didn't bring food in, and the food you did make was not just lying around, it was usually in your stomach because you didn't usually have enough, this was a very simple process. And as you can see, you only searched where the food went. If you didn't take chametz into your attic, you didn't need to search your attic. If you didn't take chametz into your basement, you don't search your basement. And that still applies to today. This is one reason why I like to remind people, Passover cleaning is not spring cleaning. This is not the time to be doing everything. This is only the time for, or this is the time for only focusing on getting rid of chametz. Now, we still do this searching with a lamp, with a candle. It's called Bedikat Hametz. And like I said, it's normally done on the 14th of Nisan. However, this year, we have a little bit of a wrinkle. The first night of Passover is on a Saturday night. And since we cannot light a candle and carry it around on Friday night, because Shabbat would have already begun, we instead do our search for the Bedikat Hametz. We do our search for Hametz on the Thursday night of the week before Passover. And then you set aside any of the food that you're going to eat on Friday day and Saturday morning before you would normally have to get rid of everything in order to eat, and then you eat it very carefully, and you put the crumbs or leftovers into the trash, and then it is gone. Now, as far as how vigorous do you need to search, are we getting out a magnifying glass? I again turn back to the Mishnah. Regarding the dough in the cracks of a trough, they would work their dough on a wooden plank. If there be as much as an olive's bulk, in one place it is obligatory to remove it. But if not, it becomes annulled because of its small bulk. So the Mishnah and Halacha is clear. What we're looking for are crumbs the size of an olive. We are not looking for microscopic dots of dust. So this means that you do not need to be going with a toothbrush into tiny little crevices, but you do general clean. Okay, question, comment? Okay, so here we go with our general rules of how we're going to take care of the cleaning. We start off, as we just said, everything you own has to be cleaned and checked to make sure that it's free of chametz. However, if during the year chametz is not taken to that place, you don't have to clean it or check it for chametz. So for example, if you are the kind of person who never allows food to be in the car, you don't need to check your car. On the other hand, if you're the kind of person who eats a sandwich in your car with some regularity, then you do need to check inside your car. However, that does not mean that you have to get out all the special car cleaners and go over the dashboard or clean your wheels or clean the engine, because I'm pretty sure you're not eating food in those places. Any article which is not used on Pesach, that you're not going to use during the week of Passover, does not need to be checked for chametz, as long as you put it away and the chametz is sold. We'll come back to that selling a little later. So you can put things away that you're not going to use for chametz. And indeed, in our house, for most of our cupboards and cabinets in our kitchen, they are simply sealed up before Passover begins, and we sell any chametz that may be embedded in the pots and pans and plates that are of the things inside of them. Crumbs which have been rendered completely inedible to the extent that they're not fit to be eaten by a dog, that's a technical term in Jewish law, are not considered chametz. They are now considered blech. They're junk. They're terrible. So the general obligation to check for and destroy crumbs does not apply if the crumbs are less than the size of an olive and are dirty or spoiled enough to prevent a person from eating them. Conclusion, you use a household cleaner that will spoil the crumbs slightly to the extent that people would not eat them. This is the time to get out your Windex or your counter wiper or your bleach mixture, whatever it is that's safe and effective. But you would definitely not want to eat a piece of food if you drag that rag over it. That's what you want to be using for all of your cleaning. to make sure that just in case you didn't get something, if the rag went over it, it can now be considered to no longer be food. It is now trash. Everyone got the basic ideas here? Okay. So now we clean responsibly. Right now, one might be tempted to insist on doing the extra work anyway, right? You might say, I want to be machmir, the Hebrew word for stringent. However, in those stringencies, there is danger, right? There is danger of causing laxities and brushing aside mitzvahs completely during the Seder. So the problem is that you may think you're being stringent by, taking a blowtorch to your house to clean it, but in the process of doing that, you are going to overlook many of the other aspects of the holiday. And so you can't afford to be so strict that you are neglecting other actual mitzvahs. We need to be as careful as the commandments say, but not more, in order that we have the same time and energy to be careful on all of the other commandments. Specifically, many may like to do cleaning, more cleaning than the minimum, and they'll do it to such an extent that some even incorporate the general spring cleaning into their Passover chores, like we talked about. These extra exertions should not prevent them from fulfilling their obligations on Passover, and particularly on the Seder night. And one of those obligations is to be happy. Right? All of our holidays, we are supposed to be happy. If the cleaning that you are doing, that is beyond the minimum that's necessary for Passover, is leaving you miserable and exhausted so that you cannot participate well in the Seder or not enjoy it with your full heart, then you need to redo your work schedule. You need to decide to cut back on the unnecessary cleaning. Yes, some cleaning is needed, but if you are being very careful with our 6 points here, then the cleaning should not be too terrible. As long as you are taking care of what you need, you don't need to kill yourself for things that are not needed. Clean them after Passover. Clean them in a completely different month. Handle them at another time. Don't take away from the joy of the holiday by overworking yourself unnecessarily. All right, shall we get down to some of the specifics for different categories of cleaning? Hearing no objection, on we go. Cleaning your floors. Yay, we do not live with earth floors. Most of us have wood or tile or linoleum or carpet. We're not just living with a dirt floor. And we should be very, very happy with that, because our floors don't have big cracks and crevices that crumbs could fall into. So sweep the floor, wash the floor with a floor cleaner, and you're done. You do not need to go into each crack. You do not need to get on your hands and knees. You are fine with a sweeping and a washing with a cleaner. Everything is good. The same routine I imagine you would have for when you normally wash your floors, which I hope you do with some regularity in any case. Food cabinets. If the cabinet is going to be used on Pesach, if you're going to actually keep your food in that cabinet that you're going to need during Passover, take out everything that's in the cabinet, wash the cabinet with a rag soaked in the cleaner like we talked about before, and be sure that it gets into all the cracks, and then if there were any crumbs, that it would be soaking it. Now, I can tell you personally that that's a lot of work, and it's not necessary. Remembering back on our list of the 6 points, if you're not going to use the cabinet, seal it up. Just close the door, close the lid, whatever type of cabinet you have, put a piece of tape over it, put a big sign on it to say, do not open, and then walk away. And store the food you need for the week on a table or on a floor or on a counter or somewhere else. We generally use our dining room table as our Passover food station. And that makes life much, much easier, and it's much easier to see what you have available. And it does not require this additional step. The refrigerator, well, that you're probably going to need. And so before Passover begins, take the food out, wash over the refrigerator with that rag, and you're done. Thankfully, most of our modern refrigerators are pretty easy to clean. They are usually made with nice plastic and glass, and that makes the cleaning fairly easy. And the best thing is that two things, I guess two things, I can't say one best. There are two things very important to remember. One, you should be cleaning your refrigerator at least once a year anyway, because refrigerators often have spills and yuck that grows in them. So cleaning them at least once a year is a good idea. So don't think of this as being too difficult. And two, you don't need to actually remove every possible stain that maybe is in the plastic. As long as you have gone over it with the rag, and as long as that cleaner has made it so that it's no longer considered food, then whatever that stain may have been, it's not important anymore. It's no longer food. Sinks. You're going to have to clean your sinks. Again, this should be a regular process anyway. In order to clean them for Passover, however, in addition to the normal cleaning with the rag, we pour a kettle of boiling water into them and along the sides. This is part of the process of irui, which we talked about before when dealing with kashrut in general, and this allows anything that's embedded in them to come out and be washed away. Now, that is sufficient. However, most people in the modern world, myself included, usually will have a little tub, a little container that they'll use to do the washing up in, rather than doing the washing in the naked sink itself. It's technically not necessary, but it is the common practice among most people who are keeping Passover. Countertops. If you use your countertop for hot chametz, for example, if on your counter itself, the bare counter, not things on the counter, but the countertop, you will dump out a boiling pot of pasta, or you will throw out a steaming loaf of bread, then you have to clean the countertop very well, and then use hot boiling water that's poured over them. Or, since that may not be an option depending upon how your kitchen is set up, then you would cover the countertops so that anything you use during Passover cannot come into direct contact with the counter surface itself. Now, even if you do not have an issue with hot chametz because you never put anything hot on your counter itself, but only on cutting boards or other types of trays, it is still common for many people to cover their countertops. It's not as hard as it sounds. You can use things like aluminum foil. Personally, we tried to make something a little more durable. We just went to a fabric store, bought clear plastic that is flexible. You lay it out, you cut it to the shape of your counter, you tape down the edges, and now you've got a beautiful transparent counter cover, and you don't have to worry about this at all. So it takes all of about 5 to 10 minutes to lay them out. Tabletops, like your kitchen table or dining room table, places that you eat. Again, wash them off, make sure there's nothing actually on them, and give them a good cleaning with that household cleaner. That's good. Again, if you'd like to put more coverings on it, you're allowed and welcome to, but it is not necessary. Your stovetop. Wash the top, washing the side surfaces that are exposed with a rag soaked in the cleaner. Hopefully you're picking up on that theme. If there are old grates, if you have a gas stove or a metal stove that uses those hot metal grates, then they can be koshered first by cleaning them and then lighting all the burners and putting them onto their maximum temperature for about 5 to 10 minutes, just letting them glow there for a bit, and then you're good. Everyone still with me? I know this is a lot of technical. You can always go back to the YouTube and just hit pause for any of these points. And of course, if you have details about your particular kitchen, let me know. And you should notice that almost all of the difficult difficult cleaning is happening in the kitchen. You're probably not going to have to do much in the other parts of the house. Your oven. Wash out any chametz that's still in there. Take a nice damp rag or make sure that it's been removed. Use that same cleaner that you've been using. Then heat the oven and turning it up to its highest temperature for 1 hour. If your oven, like most, has a self-cleaning cycle, then after you have cleaned it out, the self-cleaning cycle will do the job for you. Be careful, ovens get hot, just in case you didn't know. Now, if you're not going to use the oven during all of Passover, then technically you can just put a piece of tape over and you're not going to have to worry about it. But most people like to cook things and roast things in Passover. So the oven is definitely something that needs to get clean for most of us. Pots, pans, dishes, cutlery, all the things that are not like cooked in the heat, but instead are on top of the stove, or that we use to cut up and prepare things that are hot, right? If it's not going to be used for Passover, put it away, lock it up, seal it out of view so that you can't use it. Put them in a Ziploc baggie if you don't have room to put them somewhere else, and then put a piece of tape around it so you don't accidentally use them. And then only the things that you need, only the things that you're going to use, then you have to kosher them. And yes, that koshering will follow the same process that we talked about in the previous class on keeping kosher, which for most of them is going to involve having a kosher pot raised to a boil full of water and dunking the items in them and taking it out. You can refer back to that kosher class for more details on that, or contact me and I'll give you more information. But it is very simple, but again, be careful, don't burn yourself. Now, if that sounds like a lot of work, well, depends how many sets of knives and forks you really think you need. It's easier to just wash more frequently during Passover than actually koshering 36 sets. But if you want to make your life really easy and you've got space somewhere in your garage, you can take all of these things and buy them special just for Passover and keep them in a nice tub and bring them out, use them for a week, close it up, put it away for the rest of the year. And that will greatly reduce the amount of work that you need to do to get ready for Passover. And yes, I will say that is exactly what my family and I do. We have our pots and pans, or most of our pots and pans for Passover done this way. We do still kosher a few of the ones that we don't have duplicates of, but our knives and forks and things like that, we keep for Passover and only Passover. And they just live in the garage for 51 weeks out of the year. Dish towels, tablecloths, just throw them in the washing machine. Just make sure there's nothing actually attached to them. No bits of, pasta still stuck on them. But throw them in the washing machine. It's perfectly fine. No additional preparation is needed. You don't need to have special dish towels or tablecloths for Passover. All right, questions or comments before we get to the sale of chametz? Okay, so this is something that many people feel is a loophole, that this is somehow violating the spirit of Passover. I need to tell you it's not. It is in fact essential. So let me walk you through it. First of all, the need. In the ancient world, like we discussed, people had a few pots, a couple knives, plates were usually wooden slabs, or they were just like homemade pottery that you would throw away and you could make more. Go down to the river, get some more clay, boom, you have a new bowl. Now, the modern world, consumer materialist world that we live in, everyone owns pots, plates, and other items that are too numerous to be koshered, or physically cannot be kosher. For example, most of your standard plates are made of a ceramic that cannot be made kosher for Passover. It literally, physically, by all the laws of kashrut, you cannot take a plate that is just a regular pottery plate and make it kosher for Passover. That would mean that you would have to throw it out every single year. On top of that, there are many items that people have that simply cannot be kosher. Most people have a toaster. There is no way in this beautiful world of ours to make a toaster kosher for Passover. You cannot disassemble it enough and then soak it in boiling water, or more likely because of its direct heat, put it into an actual oven and raise the temperature up to 500 degrees, reassemble it, and expect that toaster to work. You would have to be throwing it out and buying a new toaster every single year. We simply live in a very wealthy world compared to our ancestors, with numerous items that we cannot afford to destroy and get rid of. And indeed, we should not, because there is another mitzvah called Bal Tashchit, which means that we do not needlessly destroy or waste things. And to needlessly destroy or waste all of our pots and pans, all of our plates, all of our toasters, blenders, and other things would be a violation of that command, especially since there is an alternative. There's an alternative to throwing all of these things out that we would be stuck with, and that's called selling the chametz. What this means is that anything that you can't use during Passover, your toaster, your blender, the things like that that you can't or are not going to clean, you put them away, we label and seal it so that we don't accidentally use it, and then you sell the chametz to a non-Jew. And at the end of the holiday, you buy it back. Now, most people are not experts in how to handle buying and selling according to Jewish law, which is a little different than American law. There are processes of giving and taking. We can go to my Mishnah class if you want to see more about that. So it's best handled by an expert. That's me, which means that you will soon see a post through WhatsApp and through our email and on Facebook that if you would like me to sell the chametz on your behalf, I will take care of that for you. So I'll take that off your plate, pun intended, and that way you can be sure that any of the chametz that's still left in the physical address of your home doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the non-Jew with whom I have arranged the sale. Make sense? Like I said, I'll be sending out a form through the various digital formats, and you'll be able to just click and sign up for that. Now, we mentioned the Bedikat Mates before, the search for the chametz, that we do this on the 14th. As I mentioned, we do this only on Thursday of this year, a day early, because we can't do this once Shabbat has begun on Friday. There is a blessing that goes along with this. As you can see, it is the standard mitzvah blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al bi'ur chametz. God has commanded us concerning the destruction of the chametz when we take the chametz that we have gathered and we destroy it. Right? And that, sorry, it just looked like that was a bit of a duplication. So we will search out these things, we'll take them together. We make sure that there are a few pieces where we're looking so that the blessing we said will not be a waste. There are customs from Europe of using a feather and a wooden spoon. There's not really a whole lot of good explanation originally of why those were chosen. If you like to do that, by all means, it is not necessary at all. But it's a custom for some families, and I would never say to stop a custom. That's not a problem. But I can say there is not a lot of historical evidence of why that custom began. So then we get to the bitul chametz, the nullification of the chametz. Now this is technically written in Aramaic. It was written in Aramaic because that was the language more people understood than Hebrew for much of our time. Nowadays, the language that's understood by more people, at least in this country, is English. So it's better to say it in the language you understand. And in English, as you can see, you are declaring all chametz, all leavening that is in my possession that I have not seen, I missed it when I was looking, and that I have not destroyed for whatever reason, and do not know of, and I totally forgot about it, shall be nullified and become ownerless, like the dust of the earth. That means if something happens to show up, you open your glove compartment and there's a half-eaten sandwich in there, it's okay, it's not your sandwich anymore. Take it to the trash can, throw it away, but you didn't actually violate the mitzvah because you voided your ownership of it. You made it so that it was not your property anymore with this declaration. At the same time, usually in the morning, in this particular case, that'll be Friday morning before Passover, because we're not going to light a fire on Shabbat, we burn the chametz or otherwise destroy it. If you don't have a fireplace or some other place to conveniently destroy a symbol of the chametz, it doesn't have to be a lot, just a few little bits of bread is customary, then you can destroy it in other ways, throwing it out in the trash, making sure it's gone before Passover, flushing it down the toilet, if your plumbing can handle it, that happens. That's all fine. And again, we use the similar formula: all leaven and anything leavened that is in my possession, whether I've seen it or not, whether I observed it or not, whether I removed it or not, shall be considered nullified and ownerless as the dust of the earth. And with that, we have formally gotten rid of all Hamates in our possession before Passover begins. Now, at the same time that we are getting rid of all the things that we need to get rid of, and we're cleaning what we need to clean, remember, don't go crazy, we also have the practice called Ma'ot Chitim. And this is where we give to help people make Passover. Because buying the wine, buying matzah, having enough food to celebrate is not something that everybody can afford or afford easily. So it is nice to make a donation. If you'd like to make a donation to Temple Israel so that I can help people who come to me asking help, that's perfectly fine. If you would like to make a donation to Jewish Family Services here in Orlando, I know they do great work for many families as well that are not connected to synagogues. But it is good to be to give a donation during your preparations so that you recognize that other people may need a little bit of assistance. And there are other things you need to do. But these are more general and should be looked at as being exciting and fun. You should invite people to the Seder. Now, this year with COVID, chances are, unless you know everybody has already had the vaccine, that you're not going to be inviting people outside of your immediate family. That was something that was very strange for me last year, the first Seder in 20 years that we didn't have a guest. But it is important because of the cases of COVID. So take that as a maybe, depending upon your health situation and the people that you're inviting. But it's not obligatory this year, but you should try to have guests for the Seder or be a guest with someone else's house sometime in your life. You should review the Haggadah. You should look over the commentary. You should be able to ask and answer new questions every year. And Sefaria.org has the whole Haggadah online with many commentaries, not only in Hebrew, but also many in English. Review the story of Exodus itself. Go back to the book of Exodus, begin reading in chapter 1, go all the way through. I like to get all the way through at least the 10 Commandments in chapter 20 and see the arc of our story. Review Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, to remind yourself of the eternal love between God and us. It is considered to be a beautiful allegory for our relationship. Examine your life for spiritual chametz, the things that puff you up: arrogance, snobbery, jealousy, these different types of pride or putting on airs. These are things that you should also get rid of before Passover. Try to make your life a little more humble. Try to appreciate the humility of that Pesach forces on you, and realize that should be a bit more of our regular life. And examine your life and try to ask, am I still enslaved to Egypt? Egypt was not only places where they whipped us and forced us to work, it was a place where they made our life bitter. Are there still parts of my life that make me bitter that I can find a way to let go of, to release? There is also a place where they had idols. There are things in my life that I still worship that are not worthy of my respect, not worthy of my praise. It was also a place where they valued the material goods of life. Are there things in my life that I still focus on too much? My car, my jewelry, my clothes. Can I remove them from being a priority in my life? I need them, but I shouldn't worship them. Make sure that you are not still living an Egyptian life. We got out of there. There's no reason to still be holding on to their ancient culture. All right, and with that, we're going to finish for tonight and finish for our Passover explanations. We will have class next week, but the following week, in anticipation of Passover, we will not be getting together because it's going to be a busy night, at least at my house, and I imagine at your house as well. So that means on Thursday, March 25th, there will be no class, but we do have class on the 18th. All right, any last questions or comments? Okay. As always, I am available for private questions and comments to help you with any personal situations or questions. Just contact me in any one of the number of ways you can, and I'll be happy to talk. Take care.
Rabbi.
Enjoy your Pesach. Remember, it is meant to be a celebration. It is not meant to be a new form of suffering. Take care.
Bye-bye, Rabbi.